I'm really, really pleased and honored to have Heather Davis with us today. Heather is an assistant professor of culture and media at the New School. I first knew of her through her work, which she co-authored, called Art in the Anthropocene: Encounters Among Aesthetics, Politics, Environments, and Epistemologies, which is a book which is copyleft. You can download it, and it's accessible to everybody. But we are now looking forward to her new work, which she's been doing for a long time, I think almost 10 years, on plastics, called Plastic Matters, to be published by the Duke University Press and hopefully out in the spring of this year, 2022. And Heather, so thank you very much for talking to us here today from Canada. And I'd like to start talking about plastics. You know, we've been thinking about plastics as a new pollutant and everywhere, and microplastics. And but it's hard to reconceptualize this material except as something synthetic we've made along the way, as part of the industrial age. But you reconceptualize the word plastic. We help us think of it in many different ways. So firstly, why plastics? Why do you think it's so important? And then we get into how you rethink the word.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, Ravi. It's really it's always a pleasure and an honor to talk with you. I admire your work so much. So I'm very happy to do this with you. I first came to thinking about plastics for two reasons. One was really to kind of think through, after I finished my dissertation, which was based much more in thinking about relational subjectivity, I was really curious about what the kind of limits of relationality might be. And just kind of on a certain type of a hunch, I was thinking about plastic as a kind of limit case of relationality. And of course, it's not that plastic doesn't have all kinds of relations, it has tons of relations, but it is something that really adheres to itself under many different kinds of conditions. This is the problem with plastics, is because it doesn't have, because of its relationship to the lab, because of its relationship to industrial manufacturing, it doesn't have a kind of an ecology that is built into it that allows for it to decompose, right? And we're beginning to see that now. But the problem with plastics is precisely the fact that it doesn't have this kind of relational network that other things in this world already do, right? So that was one of the reasons. And the other one, and so I was really interested in that kind of the tensions there, how do we think through what relationality means, and where that gets us as a kind of mechanism for thinking through how we think about our existence in this world. And under the terms of your project, sort of how do we think about multi-species living when we also have to account for the synthetic? So that was sort of one of the reasons. And then the other one was really about the fact that my maternal grandfather, was an engineer for DuPont for his entire life, and then later became a manager, and was helped to develop all kinds of plastic products, including the plastic milk bag that we use here in Canada and you also use in India, and also various kinds of synthetic textiles. And so I was really interested in what do we do about these inheritances that we maybe don't want, that maybe benefit our lives in all kinds of ways. Certainly plastic is incredibly beneficial in all kinds of ways, and it also has constituted us. So there's no way that I can separate myself from plastic. And I don't just mean because of my own family lineage, which of course is also true, but also because of the ways in which plastic was with me before I was born. It'll be with me after I die. It really is one of the fundamental things that has shaped our material existence in this world at this moment in time. And so I was curious about, well, what does it mean to sort of think through these kinds of complicated inheritances, or the ways in which we inherit the world, and then what do we do about those types of inheritances? How do we really think through that relationship, especially when for me, one of the other things about that kind of line of thinking was really that I saw plastic in some ways as a kind of condensation of a particular type of understanding, or distillation rather, of a particular type of understanding of how we interact with matter in general, kind of coming from the kind of vantage point of Western philosophy and Western ideology. So I was really interested in using plastic as a case study for thinking through these kinds of philosophical inheritances that have also really kind of gotten away from us in terms of how plastic has now transformed the world that we live in.
So, yeah, so you open up a host of fields of questions and inquiries through what you just said, both philosophical, relational, as well as material in a sense. So in a material sense, the history of plastics is very much, could be like a history of the Anthropocene, depending when you think the Anthropocene started, because plastic embodies, when at deep time, materials transformation, and also the current transformation of materials through human intervention, through science and technology. And then you then take it to the next level, which I've heard you speak in other forums about, these new bioforms which plastics morph with, what we call naturally evolved materials, and they become one with them into new forms which will probably coexist with them far in another time frame. So there is a kind of coexistence of this whole history, deep history of material formation of the planet, to our short history with the relationship to the planet, and to a future where these will be the new materials which sort of could even go beyond us in a sense. So we become part of that small time frame. But what is very interesting is how you think of two other axes on plastic. One is toxicity, plastics as carriers of toxicity. And the second is of new evolutionary forms which might deal with plastics, in a sense of what kind of organisms will embody plastics as nature. So
yeah, that's sorry, go on.
But no, so so would you like to expand on any of these, because there's so many questions around them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really that's a very generous reading of my work. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the, as soon as you start kind of like looking into plastics, one of the first things one of the major kind of concerns around plastics, for very good reasons, is the relationship to toxicity. And maybe to be sort of clear about that, most of the kind of toxicity of plastics doesn't affect us so much as consumers, but it does affect people both in terms of the production phase of plastics and then in the disposal phase of plastics. And that isn't to say that there aren't other kinds of consequences for us as consumers as well. That is also certainly true, but just to say that it's really concentrated, the problems of toxicity are really concentrated in both the production and the disposal phase. And so when you start looking into that kind of toxicity, what you kind of immediately run across, for me, is a concept that Stacy Alaimo came up with, which is the transcorporeal. So she really talks about the transcorporeal as the ways in which our bodies are really not just our own, right? That we think of ourselves as individuals, or we think of ourselves as somehow sealed or contained. And in some ways, this is also what the dream of plastic is about, right? Like the dream of plastic is that you somehow can create these kind of beautiful containers, or that you can seal something off. I mean, it's physically used for these purposes most of the time, or much of the time. 40% of plastic is used in packaging. And so there's this idea of containment that is kind of built into plastic in and of itself. And that kind of idea or ideal is then kind of transferred into a notion of ourselves as individuals, as subjects in the world, as beings that are moving through the world, that we can somehow seal ourselves off or contain ourselves from the world itself. But of course, that's just untrue, right? So, I mean, it's a fantasy. It's a very profound, powerful fantasy that has really dictated a lot of the ways in which we understand environmental harm. But it just is untrue, because the ways in which our bodies work is that we're incredibly permeable. Our skin surfaces, for example, is the largest organ, and so whenever we're touching anything or breathing in anything, including plastics, it's coming into our bodies, and we're not 100% sure what it's doing to our bodies. So there's all kinds of different effects that plastics can have, ranging from cancers to diabetes, to other kinds of different effects, and especially in relationship to the chemical compounds that are called plasticizers, which when chemists put together plastics, when they put them together, the long chain of molecules that become the plastic object, those tend to be incredibly stable. But then what's added to them is plasticizers in order to make plastics pink or heat resistant, or whatever other kinds of qualities they want to add for various kinds of products. And those tend to be just kind of attached to the long chain of molecules, which means that they're very easy to come off, and they do come off all the time. So when people think of something like new car smell, that is plasticizers just detaching and circulating in the air that you're then inhaling, and all the kinds of additives that are put into plastics have other kinds of properties. And one of those properties that I was interested in is the property of endocrine disruption. So there's a whole class of chemicals that are associated with plastics that are endocrine disrupting chemicals, and those chemicals have far and wide ranging effects on the body. But one of the effects on the body is that it disrupts our hormonal systems, which means that we're increasingly seeing the quote feminization of male fetuses, and kind of increasingly seeing the kind of queering of bodies out in the world because of these chemicals and because of this toxicity. And to me, this is interesting, right? So it's not just a kind of, like, obviously the kind of imposition of chemicals without people's consent is a kind of horrific act, right? I think that is the sort of baseline understanding. But at the same time, in addition to that, the effects of it, I think, are kind of fascinating, especially when we think about what are the ways in which that might be advantageous, right? So what are the ways in which we might actually think about this, like, this massive kind of queering project to be potentially productive or interesting. And for me, one of the things that I've really been deeply influenced by is in particular Mel Chen's work on toxicity. And they write about how toxicity isn't just negative, right? It's negative, right? It's not a good state of affairs, but it's not only that. So it's that, plus also, humans intoxicate ourselves on purpose all the time, right? So this is a regular human activity, and not just humans, other creatures will do this as well, because it's fun and because it's interesting. And so they take this kind of premise, and they happen to be a really chemically sensitive person, and they ask after, like, what are the kinds of maybe unwanted or unwelcomed, but nonetheless kind of like interesting, productive mental and physical states that come about because of this widespread toxicity. And given the fact that we can't remove plastics at this point in time, they're so pervasive, they're everywhere, they're they're in every part of our bodies. They're in human placentas. They're in between the cellular. They're in between. They're so small that they're in our cells, in our cellular structures. They're in the air that we breathe. You can do studies where you take snowfall, for example, and see how much plastic is coming down with the snow. So it's really just everywhere. So at this point, there's no way that we can go back to some kind of a pure state. And even though that's clearly very scary and certainly not the world that I would want, I also think that now that we're here, what can we do with it? And I think that thinking through these lines in queer theory, thinking through these lines through Mel Chen's work in relationship to toxicity, helps us to get to a place where we can at least kind of invite curiosity, which then won't leave us just kind of paralyzed in the face of what we're facing.
Right, and microplastics are everywhere. They're in the groundwater, they are in fish, they're in the oceans, they are in us. So you're right. And the idea of permeability of the body is accentuated when we think of how these microparticles and nanoparticles enter our body and probably are part of our living beings, like other organisms are already, which we don't recognize. But also plastics are deeply entangled with the environmental justice question because of the way they produce, the cancer corridors and the cancer production places, the chemicals, the disposal, the usage in terms of phthalates for infants and baby bottles, and you use a very interesting word called intimacy, which you use, the intimacy which plastics, they make petrochemicals intimate to us. That's really interesting word because you sort of bring plastics home, the whole idea of the petrochemicals home to us in a sense, the fossil economy as part of our lives. So intimacy becomes another level of thinking about relationships to something because the intimacy is a human word in a sense. So I want you to tell me more about the use of this word and how do you imagine this as part of relational issue of relationships and the questions of selves and our emotions which this brings up?
Yeah, I mean, it's that's part of that was the other reason why I was really interested in plastics to begin with, was that there's been all kinds of really wonderful work that has been done from the environmental humanities, thinking through the questions of fossil fuel economies and petrocultures and all of that stuff. But on a kind of day-to-day level, I think not many of us really interact directly with fossil fuels that regularly. Maybe if you have an oil heater or a coal heater and you have to refill it, that would be a moment, or at the gas station when you pump gas, or if you happen to be somebody who lives in a contested zone where there are pipelines being put in, or in an extraction zone, you certainly would have a much more intimate relationship with fossil fuels. But it's something that is that's so determinant of the culture that we live in. And yet it seems like this abstract entity for much of us. Even when you're pumping gas, there's no, it's so alienated from where it's coming from. But what I found really fascinating is that, plastics, which don't exist without fossil fuels, or at least not in the form that we currently have them in. There's certainly bioplastics, which we could talk about. But the form that we have plastics in currently are, first of all, they kind of, part of the reason why plastics exist so much, so abundantly, is because of the fact that the fossil fuel industry had all of this excess waste that they didn't know what to do with. And so there's been massive kind of correlations. For example, in the United States, when the fracking industry really took off, all of a sudden plastics production really massively increased as well, because there's all kinds of byproducts of that fracking industry that that you can't, which is natural gas, which you can't use for the natural gas itself, but you can sell it to companies who can then turn that material into plastic. So there's this relationship between the kind of waste of the fossil fuel industry and plastics, which I think is useful to follow for questions of environmental justice. But in addition to that, it's like plastics are really everywhere, right? It's like not just in the sense of like the microplastics that are everywhere in the water and the air and in our bodies and in the bodies of many, many, many species that have been studied. But rather that it's also really, when I say that it really constitutes our lives, you know, like a lot of people who've written about plastics sort of do this exercise where they talk about all the plastics that they come into contact with when they get up in the morning, right? And all of the things that are enabled because of plastics. So, you know, this conversation wouldn't be able to be happening if it weren't for plastics. I'm talking to you through plastic headphones, the wires that are connecting the transatlantic undersea cables that allow the internet to exist are constituted through plastics. Digital platforms have about 30 to 40% plastics in them. Cameras, same thing. But that also, you know, I don't know about your glasses, but my glasses that are sitting on the table beside me are also made of plastics, and so are baby bottles, and so are our clothes, and so are some sex toys. And it's like, they really are the objects that we interact with in our home on a regular basis. And you're right that this is also differentiated based on class. So one of the statistics that I heard at a particular moment in time is that you can actually tell people's class status based on their body burden. So the body burden is the type and amount of toxicity that is found in our bodies. And people, this is maybe North American specific, but people who are from lower classes tend to have a huge amount of BPA or other endocrine disruptors in their bodies because of the amount of plastics that people use, because plastics are cheap materials, right? So they're found everywhere. It's easy to use them. You can get them cheaply. And then people who are from higher classes tend to have a lot of mercury and lead and stuff in their bodies because of access to fish and eating seafood. So, which, you know, that's maybe not necessarily always a high class activity, but here in North America it is, because of how expensive those products often are. But what I think is really interesting is that ways in which, if we're going to reconfigure our relationships to plastic, if we're going to really think through what it is and what it actually means for us in the world, I think that one of the things that's really important is to start from this point of view of the body and from the point of view of our intimate and everyday connections, and to not kind of, you know, one of the things that I've been a bit skeptical of in terms of critical theory is the ways in which sometimes we like to take this really distanced approach to some of the things that are happening in the world. We want to create a kind of moral distance between ourselves and the people who are involved in particular kind of extractive industries. We want to take this kind of physical distance. There's all these kinds of mechanism, critical distance. There's all these mechanisms for distance to be a desirable phenomenon. And I'm a little bit skeptical of that when it comes to something like plastic, because first of all, we can't create distance from plastic. That's actually impossible. And then I also think in terms of like a critical methodological approach, I'm not sure it's the right approach, because I actually think that when we're looking at these industries that are extractive, I think it's much more interesting to ask what happens when you try to get closer to them. What happens when you try to investigate them? What happens when you try to develop a kind of new relationship with them? Not to justify their existence, but rather instead of just kind of, there's something too easy, I think, in just the kind of like the sense of removal or the sense of distance that is sometimes created in the worlds of theory and art practice. And I'm much more interested in the projects where we really look at the ways in which we are so embedded in these systems, and that these systems are really a part of our bodies, and what happens when we try to get closer to them. This is part of the reason why I've been really interested in the novel organisms that come out of plastics. So plastics, because they're so widespread now, there are all these organisms that can actually successfully metabolize plastics, and those are mainly various forms of bacteria and a couple different forms of mycelium, and I'm interested in thinking about those beings, those new beings, as a kind of non-filial human progeny, right? Or kind of queer kin. So what does it mean if we actually adopt those as organisms that we actually have to create responsibility for, care for? When I started proposing this to people, there's definitely a lot of people who were kind of horrified by this idea, and I can understand why. But I also think that if we thought of these things as things that we have to take care of, that we're somehow responsible for, and that we're in relationship with, that we would have a completely different relationship to those materials than in this kind of like distance approach, where we can kind of easily critique these systems without understanding our own complicities or our own entanglements.
I mean, I think this idea of just you bring intimacy into distance, and I think this is really important, because we are sort of immersed in this moment, immersed with everything, with the chemicals, with the materials, and the materials are just not materials. The materials are part of a time, of a condition, of a history. They are both historical and political materials in a sense. And so we are in them. And as true researchers, we want to distance to be objective about them, but we are no longer objective observers because we are in it. I mean, can you imagine a time when our brains get plasticized, that you can never remove yourself, your thought process? I mean, that could be artificial intelligence, for example, when your brain is plastic, or that it changes the idea of the your and who and I in a self, in a sense. And that doesn't seem to be too far away as a next step. So of course you talk of adopting and looking after the new bioforms, which is really interesting idea of what the new, we're not just talking of multi-species in the species as we know them, we're talking of multi-species in the new evolutionary species, which are being formed, a new nature in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to think about this makes you also a kind of activist in this area, not necessarily, but just to think about this material as something which is part of it. It's opening up a whole moment of the Anthropocene, I think. It's opening up a whole immersive moment of the Anthropocene, which we don't realize. Like in the climate change, we don't realize that we are in it. We are not outside of it. So what does that do to things like agency, or things like, is it an acceptance or an agency, or how do we think of ourselves as something different? Because you also mentioned about toxicity, not just as negative, but as formulative of new futures in a sense. So where does it leave us as who we are in that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I don't know if I totally have a complete answer to that. I feel like that's maybe an answer that we need to kind of think through collectively.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what I would say is that I do think that thinking with plastic and thinking through these kinds of timescales that you're referring to, this kind of way in which we have to think about deep time and future deep time, kind of simultaneously, I do think that it calls upon us to have a kind of more ethical relationship to materiality in general, right? To really kind of consider what why we're using particular materials and whether it's necessary. You know, I do think that it asks of us, is it always good to be manipulating molecules, for example, right? Which I realize is like a very fundamental premise of modern biology, chemistry, right. You know, everything. And I'm not saying that we should stop that practice altogether, but I do think that there needs to be a little bit more thought taken in when and where and why we're doing these things, right? And not just because it feels like for much of the 20th century, a lot of the ways in which things got developed was sort of a combination of for-profit and because we can, and military applications, right? And I think, you know, kind of grappling with that. I mean, that's certainly the case with plastics, right? And so really kind of rethinking what we want to be oriented to. I do think that like that is, you know, I mean, yeah, I mean, it kind of very quickly leads into problems of political economy and, you know, those types of overarching frameworks that really also are so important in our lives. But also I think in terms of this kind of question of agency, I mean, I think that this is part of what is interesting about thinking about something like toxicity or intimacy, is to reimagine what it means to have relationships with objects, and like relationships where there's a kind of ongoing engaged commitment, right? Instead of just like something that we pick up and use and discard. Or what does it mean to really seriously consider our bodies as permeable or as kind of microcosms of the larger environments that we live in, right? I think if we really seriously believed that, then we would have to stop a lot of the projects that are currently underway, right? Because I don't think if you really seriously believed that people were microcosms of their environment, which I think we are, you couldn't be saturating the environment in this kind of chemical toxicity in the ways in which we do. And obviously that, as you were alluding to earlier, it really has to do with who you are, right? So the kinds of relationships to environmental racism that continue and that are kind of that are exacerbated under these conditions, all of that obviously is still present, right? So certain bodies are rendered to be fungible, or certain bodies are rendered to be thrown away or discarded and not taken seriously, so that the rest of us can live with much more comfort, right? So I do think that you also kind of immediately run into these questions of justice, and you know where our kind of agency lies in all of this. I think is maybe not totally straightforward, because if we also are really thinking of ourselves as more than individuals, then we both have to kind of be thinking about ourselves in terms of the kinds of microcosms, the kinds of ecologies that are within our own bodies, but also our collective practices with humans and more than human worlds. But certainly those are the types of questions that kind of immediately pose themselves when we really think about these things to their logical conclusion.
Yeah, and of course there's a gender question, because these chemicals have differential impacts on different bodies, gendered bodies in a sense. So, and I think we've never looked at material. We've always looked at materials like plastics. I mean, plastic epitomizes the industrial and the post-industrial age in a sense. And talking to you as you were describing how it's pervasive everywhere, including everything we are doing right now, sort of brings home to the fact that we are immersed in this soup, which is such a complex soup in a sense. But we are not able to really think about this as separate, because we still see ourselves as separate from this soup in a sense. Like we are protected, we are separate, we are individuals. But this questions this idea of separateness, as you mentioned, in a sense that we are being formed by it as well. We are being reformed by this into new, almost new biological beings, for better or for worse, in a sense. So it to me it opens up so many challenges to how we have thought about ourselves as individuals, as this idea of, even ideas of liberty and equality. And when we think of these new kinds of forms, and I think somewhere you also have mentioned about how toxicity is something which is not a break. Toxicity is something which lives with us and reforms us. And so we never get, like COVID, we'll never get rid of it. We'll just have another form, in a sense, maybe biologically too, where it becomes part of our systems. So we're looking at materials becoming integrated into who we are. And I'm wondering, what does that do to philosophical questions of selves and relationship to society, and whether we have moved ahead from, we've really improved the question of discrimination and equality and these big things of modernity, liberty and equality. But the separation of material from the self, material is something, science, which exists out there for our betterment and ourselves, which I often question whether we have really moved so far in that direction, or whether just becoming more and more entrenched in those things we were challenging 500 years back when we started to saying we have to have a different society. So I'm just sort of getting you to react on, because you've thought so much about all these things, not only, you bring so much science into your thinking, but you also bring so many other philosophical and relational questions, which makes it like a real pursuit of ourselves, of a complexity of ourselves. So how do you see this going? Where do you see this? Where do you see us going, societies going, or just as a speculation also?
Maybe what else? I have no idea where we're going, but I definitely.
No,
I think
also in
things,
terms of our, as you mentioned, our power, our agency and power not to be able to counter the deep emotions we have. So I'm not talking only in sort of philosophical terms, but also in real terms, that we have all these sort of desires to have equity, justice, and liberty and equality, and we don't seem to be getting there, in a sense, as we can see from the politics around the world. And I think the material world has a lot to do with the condition of the current world in terms of capital concentration and capital accumulation and all these things, the way so there's a deep connection between what's happening to us and how the world is constructed. So through your thinking about these materialities like plastics, in both in philosophical terms, but also in material terms. So my question was about that, in a sense.
About that, yeah. Sorry. No, I think that I completely agree with you. I think you're completely right. I think that part of the reason why we can, there's so much in feminist theory and critical race theory that talks about the ways in which people are turned into objects, right? We've literally made people objects through the slave trade or through other ways in which people were turned into objects. So I think that this is the fundamental problem, right? Is that I think that you're right. I think that if we believe that the world is full of objects, it's very easy then to also put those paradigms onto people, right? But if we don't believe that the world is full of objects, right? If we believe that the world is full of subjects, in that kind of dualistic thinking, but I think that we probably need to complexify our language and have maybe a more nuanced way of thinking through these things. But if we seriously considered trees as subjects, or even like non-animate, but we would often consider non-animate objects like rocks as subjects, then I think that we end up in a completely different type of a paradigm that, I don't know if it would lead to the elimination of all the problems that we face as people, but I certainly think it would go quite far in terms of rethinking, reimagining questions of hierarchy, questions of power differentiation, both to the natural world, but also between each other, right? I think that you're completely right. I think that you can't have capital accumulation if you don't believe that you can, or rather, maybe I'll put it the other way around because it's a bit easier to say it that way, but you can only have capital accumulation if you fundamentally believe that the world is full of objects, right? And objects being something that can be possessed, something that has no agency, something that has no subjectivity, something that has no relationality, something that you can in fact kind of remove from its place of origin without doing any real harm. So all of that becomes quickly undone if you really start to seriously grapple with the questions of the subjectivity of other types of beings. But which doesn't make it any less complicated though, because then all of a sudden you end up with the problem of how do you reconcile the needs and wants of kudzu versus the needs and wants of an old forest, right? Versus the needs and wants of these plastic eating organisms versus the needs and wants of something else. So there's clearly a kind of, I think that sometimes part of the reason why people push back on this kind of concept of multi-species is because it seems maybe a bit too everything's going to be fine, or the things out in nature are just harmonious or whatever. And that's obviously not true, right? There's all kinds of conflict and different conflicting desires. There are lots of organisms that thrive under capitalism. There's lots of organisms that thrive under the processes of industrialization. And so you do, I think, have to be willing, as Elizabeth Pavanelli would remind us, to be on the side of certain worlds and not on the side of other worlds, right? And I think that is something that's kind of going to be there regardless of the ways in which we think about multi-species relations. But I also just, I completely agree with you. I think that a lot of these questions of equity and justice that we're still very much grappling with really come from this lineage of thinking and legal frameworks and corporate frameworks that are all fundamentally about the kind of objectification of the world, either of plants and animals or of people.
Is that an ethical question for us, or is it something else?
I'm trying to. Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that I think that it's hard. I certainly think it's an ethical question. I also think it's a political and philosophical question. I was trying to think back, one of the kind of people that are in my brain, regardless of that deeply shaped my thinking, both probably in positive and negative ways, is Deleuze and Guattari, and which probably makes a lot of sense, right? They're not so concerned with questions of the individual. They're really interested in questions of desire under capitalism, and they're really interested in thinking through questions of relationality and assemblages. And I was trying to think about what is the difference between kind of ethics and politics and philosophical projects in their work. And one of the things that they really insist upon is the generation of new concepts as a primary philosophical project. So I certainly do see the work of thinkers and artists as doing that work of generating new concepts as a way of kind of contributing to a kind of ecology of ideas that that then allows us to maybe shift our ethical and political orientations. Because you know, for all of its faults, I do think that that kind of ideation is necessary. You know, I don't think you get something like communism without Marx, right? And you know, we can talk about why that didn't happen well in the real world, and you know, all of that kind of stuff. But it's like it's an incredibly important concept that radically reframes our understandings of how we might orient ourselves to the world. So I certainly think that, yeah, the kind of proposition of thinking through multi-species, for example, I think is an ethical question, even if it is kind of operating at the realm of the philosophical concept.
Right. The desire to think about it is an ethical quest, but it encompasses everything else.
Yeah, and I think it comes with certain kinds of obligations, and I think that that's like what for me is interesting about it.
You had a deep interest and a belief in the arts, and both from your earlier work on art and the Anthropocene, and also from the various ways in which you follow artistic practices. So I'm curious about that, and what gives you that hope in the artist?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because I've always loved kind of contemporary visual art, and there's a number of reasons for that. But I think maybe the primary reason is because I see in artistic projects an ability to articulate a kind of complicated set of ideas or position or a kind of reflection of the world that doesn't have to be resolved, right? So like within a kind of traditional academic essay, you kind of have to make an argument, you have to prove your point, you know, like all of this stuff. And then, but within the space of artistic practice, I think the most successful projects are the ones where there is no resolution, and you're just left sitting with all of the kind of contradictions or the complexities of the world. And I think that like within that space, I think it's both the kind of more, it can allow us to reflect on how our lives actually are, right? Like our lives actually are that, right? That they're not this kind of space of resolution. But also I think it allows us to be able to see things differently. So it gives us this kind of moment or opportunity to either really feel something that we haven't felt before, or to think about something that we haven't thought about before, but to be present with it. And I think that there's, I think that that's why I've always had such an admiration for contemporary visual arts practices. And then I also just think that beauty is incredibly important. Like I think that one of the things that is really sometimes can be challenging within just straightforward activist spaces is the ways in which there's both sometimes necessarily, like for very good reasons, for very strategic and important reasons, a kind of lack of certain kinds of complexity, but also sometimes a kind of lack of appreciation or sitting with the kind of the beauty of things. And I think that artistic spaces allow us, like, people aren't going to be moved by just argument, right? They're not just going to be moved by moral frameworks. I think people are moved often by beauty. They're often moved by the kind of lure of something seductive, and that, I think, is the power of artistic expression, is that it can be a kind of lure, it can be a seductive element, that it's the creation of desire, essentially, which is a kind of maybe a counter desire to the desire that capitalism instills in us, or hopefully. I mean, I know there's the art market.
No,
We
it's
can talk
true.
all about that, but
I understand, and I think it's important you say that. But also, it could maybe lead to what you just stated a bit earlier about rethinking, reconceptualizing new concepts when you refer to Marx as a new way of thinking. And I think when we unlock ourselves, we can have the ability to come with new frameworks, because maybe the new trajectories are not in just countering the existing trajectories, but in a completely sort of alt world, in a sense, and crossing a boundary of something and into a new framework where the whole thing can appear different, in a sense. So you are an academic, but also have an unusual interest in the arts. And I think that is really, to me, very exciting and interesting. And I think the process of art can bring that into human existence, in a sense, into our consciousness, which is, I think, the grand idea of creativity and art, in a sense. And it's like any new idea, where does it come from? It comes from a sense of beauty. I think all new ideas are beautiful as well. They fit together well, which work, in a sense. So, I mean, I can talk to you for hours. All the best to you, and I'm really looking forward to your book. And I keep listening to your talks on YouTube and here and there. They're fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much, Ravi. It's really such a deep pleasure and honor for me to in conversation with you. It really, really means a lot. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Yeah, have a good evening.
Touch one way or the other.
Okay, perfect.
Bye then.
Okay, bye.